In 1948, two men were found dead on a tiny island in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. There were no signs of violence, struggle, or even life on the island for months. And to this day, no one knows how they got there or how they died. The island is called Anguilla, and it was first discovered by Christopher Columbus during his second voyage to the Americas. He named it after the eel-like shape of the island and the many sand dunes that look like humps along its shores. But he never actually landed there. It wasn't until 23 years later that the British explorer Sir Thomas Warner became the first European to set foot on the island. It then made a sharp turn to the west and crashed into the sea. But why? Was it mechanical failure, pilot error, bad weather, or something else entirely? The answer, it seems, may lie in the plane's logbook. He claimed it for the British and called it Anguilla, which means little anguish. In fact, they had been living on the island for generations without any interference from the outside world. A patrol boat from the Royal Navy docked at the island, but nobody from the plane came ashore. One man in particular was obsessed with solving the mystery of the Flip-Flop Island. They also saw the plane crash into the sea, but they thought it was a spectacular new form of entertainment. Still, he couldn't let it go. He returned to the island every year to dig up more clues, and he even wrote a book about his findings. But he never got any closer to solving the mystery. He began hallucinating and seeing things that weren't there, and he eventually drowned himself. It wasn't until a few days later that they realized something was wrong. He returned to the island and interviewed the locals, many of whom were now elderly and unable to remember much about the case. But he also uncovered some new evidence. Nobody came ashore to investigate because they didn't think anyone could survive a crash like that. He also learned that the plane had been equipped with cutting-edge technology and that the men had been carrying important documents. There have been documentaries, books, and even a movie made about the case. And it continues to fascinate people to this day. The files on Project Chalk are still sealed, and the witnesses are all dead. All we do know is that they crashed a plane on a remote island, and no one noticed until it was too late. So we may never know what those men were doing on that island or how they died. His name was John Geiger, and he was a reporter for the Miami Herald. In 2016, the island was slated for development, but environmental concerns put those plans on hold. And that gave one man an opportunity to revisit the case. His name was Nick Gibbs, and he was a journalist and war crimes investigator. Maybe the truth will set us free. But until then, we can only speculate. What do you think happened to these men? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Geiger arrived on the island in 1950 and began interviewing everyone who had been there when the plane crashed. You see, Geiger was convinced that there was a cover-up. He believed that the U.S. military was involved in some kind of conspiracy and that the locals were being paid to stay silent. He accused them of stealing the wreckage and evidence from the plane, and he even claimed that the men had been spies. The men had been dead for weeks, and their bodies had started to decompose. They were buried where they had been found. They grew their own food, built their own homes, and made their own laws. And they were wary of outsiders. It was capable of carrying bombs, machine guns, and a crew of up to 9 men. They had also avoided bad weather. And when they ran out of fuel, they made a perfect crash landing in the shallows. Their plane was spotted on the island, but nobody came ashore to investigate. Not the pilots, not the U.S. military, not the local police, and certainly not the people who lived on the island. You see, Anguilla was still a British territory, but it was also home to around 1,000 people, mostly of African descent. And those people were fiercely independent. But why did they do all that? Had they been followed? Were they trying to get away from someone or something? Or was it all just a coincidence? We'll probably never know. But it was also prone to mechanical problems. In fact, it had such a reputation that it was nicknamed the Flying Fortress. It was unclear whether the plane had been maintained properly before taking off from Puerto Rico. But one thing was clear: whoever was flying the plane knew what they were doing. That all changed in 1948 when two American servicemen were found dead on the island. Their names were Guy Bannister and Louis Scarf. They had both been stationed at an air base in Puerto Rico. And on December 26th, they signed out to take a 2-day leave. But they never returned to the base. For most of its early history, however, Anguilla remained uninhabited. That is until the late 17th century, when African slaves escaped from nearby St. Martin and settled on the island. They brought with them their language, culture, and religion. And so Anguilla developed into a predominantly African island. For centuries, nothing much happened on Anguilla. It changed hands a few times, but for the most part, it remained isolated and off the radar. An air and sea search was launched, but it turned up nothing. A few days later, however, a fishing boat spotted something strange on Anguilla. So how did the men get to the island? And why were they in a crashed plane? The only clue was a small piece of paper found in the wreckage. It had a series of numbers written on it, but nobody knew what they meant. Some said it was a coded message. Others said it was just random scribblings. But what nobody knew was that those numbers would become one of the biggest mysteries of the 20th century. It was a B-25 bomber. It was upside down in the shallows near the beach and partially buried in the sand. And inside the cockpit were the bodies of the two missing servicemen. The plane had apparently crashed into the water and been pushed ashore by the waves. But there was still no sign of life on the island. And what was supposed to be a 2-day leave had turned into more than 3 weeks. The first thing investigators noticed was that the plane had traveled about 150 miles off course. It had left the airbase in Puerto Rico and flown due north. The B-25 Mitchell was a twin-engine bomber designed during World War II. The flight path showed that the pilots had taken full advantage of the winds and currents to travel hundreds of miles without using much fuel. But what we do know is that the men were reported missing almost immediately after they crashed. They had no formal government or legal system. They didn't pay taxes, and they didn't even recognize the British monarch as their head of state. So when the plane crashed on the island, they did what they had always done in the past. They ignored it. But eventually, the authorities did arrive. But that didn't stop some people from trying to dig up the truth. He learned that the locals had seen the plane in the sky, but they had assumed it was just another military aircraft. Geiger was skeptical, but he had to admit that it was a plausible theory. In fact, he made it worse. But none of his theories made any sense. And in the end, he was driven insane by the mystery. The case went cold, but it didn't stay that way for long. Gibbs was intrigued by the case, and he decided to take it on. He learned that the men had been flying a top-secret mission, codenamed Project Chalk. But what that mission entailed is still classified today. Gibbs was close to solving the mystery, but he too hit a wall. Some say they were CIA agents. Others say they were spies. But the truth is we don't know. The island is still uninhabited, and the plane is still buried in the sand. But the mystery has captured the imaginations of people around the world. Maybe someday we'll find out what really happened on Flip Flop Island.